All right, guys, welcome to another podcast. Today is an important conversation that we're going to have because many of you have been hitting me up online, emails since my last US speaking tour that I did. It was a really good speaking tour, a lot of good podcasts, a lot of good speaking engagements. People were very, very interested to learn about what Israel went through from October 7th and both during and then post. How do we handle that? Um, and so it raised a lot of conversation, a lot of requests for training for me to come back and so on. And I've been working on the side with some projects with some individuals that are kind of taken on themselves this responsibility to help educate the masses. And one of them is my guest today, Sarah Adams. She's a CIA targeter. We'll talk maybe a little bit about what that means. I don't know what that means. I'm not into the spook world. I'm into the military world. I know what that is. So she can maybe explain a little bit about her background and how that goes into basically what are the current threats in the US, in Europe, and really globally what's happening. This is not just a centralized issue. This is a global issue of jihadist agenda, which is really to take over the world under a certain banner and ideology. And I think one of the best people we have to talk about this is actually Sarah. Um, Sarah, we talked a little bit about the segment here, what we wanted to cover. Can you just give people first a little bit of background about yourself so that people can understand where you're coming from and why is it important really to listen to what we have to say here today?
Yeah, so as you said, my background, I spent about a decade at the CIA. I was an analyst and then a targeter. My focuses were mostly the Pakistan, Afghanistan region, and then I worked Libya, as most people know me from, and then I worked actually against the Iranian Quds Force. The part that is really interesting is, we were attacked in Benghazi back in 2012 because we lacked collection, right? We were a little arrogant, right? You're in the CIA, you have classified information, you think you know everything, and we had no idea what was going on, to include the fact that Al Qaeda made a base in the city. We had no idea. We had leaders in our organization meeting senior Al Qaeda commanders in Benghazi not knowing they're Al Qaeda, right? So
Mm.
we're now having the same problem with Afghanistan and this fact that basically the Taliban has been very successful at keeping information out concerning the Al Qaeda's activities inside the country. And so now we're raising the alarm again and saying, hey, right, we're failing at intelligence. A large attack is coming, and we're doing our best, as a duty to warn.
Hmm. So essentially, you were actually at the location with the U.S. presence, I guess you could say, in Benghazi during the 9/11 attack that happened in was it 2012?
Yeah, so I worked at the CIA Annex. The morning of the attack, I flew up to Europe for a meeting, and then I came back the day after, and I stayed there till the end of 2012, actually investigating on the ground.
So I've only seen the film. I know a little bit from the testimonies of the guys that have come out and spoken on this. You know some of those guys personally, obviously, since you worked on your field of expertise in that. And I would say, based on what we see in the film, it kind of, again, coming from my world, I'm IDF. I haven't served in the U.S. military, even though the accent might sound like I might have or whatever. This dual citizenship, um, but I do have a lot of military friends. I have a lot of good friends that are in different positions in either law enforcement, DEA, or what have you. It kind of gives an accurate picture, it seems like, the film in a way, with kind of the sentiments between your operator dudes and your spook community people, which they seem to be like really intelligent, really smart, but it's almost like the guys, the grunts on the ground, are kind of smelling that something's wrong, but it's like the smart guys are like, yeah, whatever. Is that true, or you know what I mean? Like, can you explain some of that dynamic in reality versus the Hollywood version of that?
Yeah, in that case, it was slightly exaggerated. Really, the
Mhm.
issue was one individual. It was our chief of station, chief of base, Bob. He didn't actually want to collect on the terrorism threat. He didn't believe it was a level it was, and he was actually pushing back on information people were collecting, to include Boone and Tonto actually found an Al-Qaeda camp, and then they went and obviously did surveillance on it, and then they were forbidden to go back there. The interesting thing is the terrorist who ran that camp, Boubacar Habib, he was involved in our attack, and he also was involved in Charlie Hebdo. So the really
Mm,
interesting thing, right, is if you
yeah.
want to turn your head and put your and not focus on these guys, they're going to come back and keep doing other things. He killed some of our officers in Iraq, U.S. military back in 2004, right? So they just keep coming. And so yeah, we have problems like that in the CIA, and it's only because of how it's organized. There's like a
Mm.
counterterrorism division, and then there's like almost like a political division, right? And they have different reporting. Where at the time in Libya, the focus of reporting was on political reporting. That was 90% of the case officers there. How is the government being formed? How are they bringing women into government? How is that affecting the economic sector? There wasn't a focus on terrorism, even as terrorists flooded in. We're doing the same with Afghanistan.
Mm.
Thousands of terrorists are flooding in there, and there isn't a focus on collecting on what they're doing, which has obviously led to horrible things like October 7th and continues like the fall of Syria and now, the fact that they're ethnically cleansing there.
So essentially, it seems to me like it's the focus is on winning hearts and minds, and less the proactive, aggressive intelligence gathering. And if the intelligence tells me that there are actual threats here that are going to undermine all the hearts and mind projects that we're working on, then it's am I saying that correctly? Like, in other words, it's clashing in as far as the interest that you're looking for, right? Like, we're not going to look at the threats. We're not going to look at the developments of what's happening. We're going to focus more on building a school or throwing more money over here and there, and somehow it's magically going to turn into a democracy like we have in the West. Is that a good kind of
Yeah.
way they're
And the
looking at it?
and the problem is, yeah, the problem is it's politics, right? I mean,
Hmm.
there's plenty of people who want to do the real work, but you are beholden to the priority frameworks of the government at the time, and you have to collect on what they ask you to collect on. So it is a policy issue influence intelligence, unfortunately.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, if you look at like Israel, right? I mean, I can't critique the US government and the CIA, NSA, FBI, whatever, because I don't live in the United States and I don't work in those fields, right? But I do work in special forces here in Israel. I have done quite a bit of undercover work for the Israeli police on drug raids, weapon seizures, all that kind of stuff in East Jerusalem, stuff that I rarely talk about, but now I am because of post October 7th. I kind of threw myself out there and I figured, screw it, right? You're going to be burnt, and if those guys recognize me, then tough. Um, and based on my work in those spheres, right, we collect intelligence from the Shabak typically because it's internal. Didn't really have any involvement at all with our external um, intelligence communities, right? And what I have noticed for me, and this is my critique for Israel, for how we handled the pre-war blowout, and from my conversations with some of those guys and asking them, what the heck were you doing? Like, we have electronical sensors, cameras, everything under the sun to protect our border, and yet this happened under your guys' watch. And so when we asked, myself and other of my friends asked these guys these questions, usually we keep getting what I feel like is a lot of BS answers. A lot of and I'm like, and you actually believe, like, we will even say, like, you believe that crap? And they kind of like, yeah. I mean, it's like they're kind of like clueless to their cluelessness. And yet this is these are the intelligence community, right? These are the smartest, brightest we have in the country, and it's like they have an excuse for everything. It feels like, as far as failures. Is it kind of like that with you guys, where these guys are really smart, really capable, but it's like it's almost like they miss the obvious?
Yeah, but I also think it's they look for what they know and they look for what they're comfortable with. So when you come in with some divergent view or you say, no, your analysis is actually incorrect or you're not collecting what you need to on the ground or from the right locations, it's like they get protective, they get arrogant, right? because they have a very strong belief that we know all the info and we are the experts. It's really interesting.
Right.
Years ago, I caught the number two of the Afghan Taliban, right? I was the expert on him and his location. But when I sat down with him and learned about him, I was like, oh my gosh, all of our collection on him is wrong. Um, and nobody understands this, right? So
Mm.
for all the time, we didn't even have the correct photo of him, right? So, but if you don't learn those things by going through and doing, you don't know that. And I think that's a very dangerous thing.
Right. So essentially, like, so what you're saying is you learned about your mistakes from your mistakes, and you took it to heart, and you basically probably analyzed differently, you processed differently, you figured out how to basically clean up your own mess, right? So to speak. Is that a good way to put that?
Yeah, but I've always been that way. So even when
Hmm.
I went to Libya, I went to go capture certain terrorists. We failed, but I actually wrote up the whole entire failure, why it failed, and how it could be successful in the future if the opportunity came again, right? But I don't think it's really easy for people to do that, unfortunately, because there's a lot of type A's, there's a lot of egos
Hmm.
across the intelligence community. And I think we've lost that. We've even lost just having two different views to look at an issue, and so it makes me incredibly concerned.
Yeah. And so essentially, then you've created a lot of ripples, obviously, in your community because you're coming out with some very very scary intelligence, and I'm voicing it on my platform, and I know that the mainstream consensus, so to speak, if you like, doesn't really acknowledge it, talk about it. So, for example, my and again, I just find it really weird because, like I said, this is not my background. It's not my field. Okay. I'm not an intelligence dude. I just know how to look at data and come with process it, right? In a very dumb, you know, basic way, so to speak, right? Not any deep intellectual whatever, and be like, okay, so this spells out danger. And so, for example, right? So, for example, we found all kinds of weapons that, got into Gaza from all the way from Afghanistan, from, all throughout the Middle East, right? All the way up into, if we want to talk about Turkey, if we want to talk about all these countries that are assisting these terrorists. And yet I had a conversation with a Green Beret. We won't mention his name because I was nice to him, but basically he is one of those guys that has slammed Israel and said that we committed war crimes. And so I had to sit down with him face to face, and we never recorded the conversation. But he kind of, I feel like he was trying to, either he's that dumb or he's playing dumb, because he says, well, how to get in there and how to get in there. If Israel has such a landlock on this place, if it's an open air prison, and you guys, control everything, then how to get in there? How do these, and I was just like, are people like that naive? I mean, we found hundreds of tunnels under the Philadelphia corridor leading into Egypt. And then that opens up the whole of the Middle East, right? They can get anywhere they want to. And like, based on the information that you've brought forward, and then me just processing it and regurgitating that, I'm like, well, there it is. But nobody's talking about it here. Nobody at all is talking about it here that I've seen in the Israeli media. And years ago, I confronted them about the Old City, for example, where Turkey is aggressively trying to take land and hold land, or what they call waqf, in the Old City to prevent the Jewish expansion, for example, in the Old City, as just one example. And that's one front. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And that's the kind of the main focal point of what I see from Turkey, from Iran, and all these countries that hate us, is really that's the trigger point, and that's why they even called the October 7th the Al-Aqsa flood. Why is anybody talking about this stuff? Neither I notice in the States or here. It's like they're afraid to discuss the obvious. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think one of the issues is, because I saw this after Benghazi, is they want to move on from Afghanistan and be done with Afghanistan. There were people who saw these weapons moving from Baram Shah in Afghanistan to Gaza. There were warnings trying to send to the U.S. government, hey, this is happening. And nothing was done about it because they don't want to collect or hear what's going on in Afghanistan. And they dismiss it right away because they're getting misinformation from the Taliban. No, of course we're not. We're doing those things. Luckily for me, I'd long watched these weapons movements. So I don't know if you know, but the person who masterminded the attack that killed CIA officers Ronan Bub, his name was Wissam bin Hamid. He's deceased now, but he was killed by the Emiratis in 2016. When he died, Abu Ubaidah, the spokesperson for Hamas, eulogized him and said he was one of the number one weapon supplier to the Al-Qassam brigades, right? He was moving the weapons from Libya into Gaza, right? So I've always
Yeah.
known and seen these weapons routes. So I do think it's funny too when people are like, well, how do these attackers get in? How do these weapons get in? And it's like there's long established routes. These terrorists are moving all over the place. This isn't complicated. It's easy to go from Afghanistan to Gaza. Heck, even very famous people have gone, like Yassin al-Suri moved into Gaza to run Al-Qaeda from there. I mean, he was one of the most famous terrorists in the world and is there right now, and nobody discusses it.
Yeah, and it really irks me that it's like we seem to want to ignore these threats as if they're going to go away. Again, going back years ago when I lived in New Mexico, I was came onto the information that you had training bases in the U.S. from these Islamic terrorists, right? And we're talking about, just to give people some context, this is back in 2008. So back in 2008, I was privy to information that there terrorist cells, not just in one area, but all throughout the United States, training for a future attack. And you can't touch them because they're following the local, laws of the land, right? But what they're doing is very shady. And obviously, if you just take a little investigative work and look into what they're doing, I'm sure you can find a way to incriminate them for terrorist activity, right? But it's like they keep getting away with this stuff. Look at what's happening in Dearborn, Michigan. Look what's happening in London, okay, or England in large, okay. You have mayors and major positions being taken place by Muslims who have immigrated in, who are wanting Sharia. Yeah, so that's just one example. Canada, the latest attack that we had, ramming attack similar to what happened in New Orleans, had just happened. What was it, like last week in Canada? So it's like these things are happening and they're the same tactics, motives, you name it. And it just seems like in the West, also in Israel, we just want to ignore it as if it doesn't exist. What do you have to say about that?
Well, our government has long downplayed Al Qaeda. About 2011, 2012, especially after they killed bin Laden, they wanted to say Al Qaeda's over, we defeated them. And as they politically did that, they actually stopped collecting, right? So right now, they don't have the collection because they have stopped collecting pretty much for 13 years. So when you don't collect the information, right? You can't report it, right? It's
Correct.
kind of like there's no there. And that's a really frustrating thing. You know, even if you go back to the time period you're talking about, you know, when bin Laden was killed, he was actually planning another large scale multi coordinated attack on US soil and then attack also on US oil tankers, right?
Mhm.
So it's another interesting thing that people don't understand. Over time, all these plots were thwarted because we were being proactive and actionable against these terrorists. Now they've had this period of 4 or 5 years where the US government kind of stepped down on targeting in Afghanistan, and they've been safe to train, plot, and then it's scarily deploy these terrorists here and then our open border let them in. So, you know, I think probably about 8,000 terrorists came in just in the last 3 years into the United States. And like you said, we're having a very hard time getting our government to actually understand it. Like even, you know, the DNI put out kind of a memo recently, and in it she focused on that they were going after, like I think it was 400 people who came through an ISIS pipeline, like Cuban smuggling bit. And it's like, no, we want to be going after the actual terrorists here planning to attack U.S. soil. And there seems to be like a disconnect, and I think it's because they lack the information to understand how powerful Al Qaeda's gotten, that ISIS can still plot and plan from their senior leadership. It's not just lone wolves. And it's this disconnect that it's, I don't know how we get over it. It's almost like you have to wait for an attack to occur for people to listen.
Mm. So you made a report that you went public on saying that there were, was it 1,500 ISIS terrorists that entered the U.S. with with intentions to carry out attacks in the U.S.
Well,
Um,
no, there's different numbers.
yeah,
So
yeah.
the
Okay, so can you explain some? Yeah.
yeah, so Al Qaeda has a very large homeland plot, and that has 1,000 attackers. It's a number of groups who are supporting that. Al Qaeda, ISIS, and then Al Qaeda affiliates, right? To include Libyans. And then the new incoming director of the National Counterterrorism Center in front of Congress said um, they at NCTC they have, I think it was 1,400 terrorists in the United States linked to just the Taliban, and I want to say it was it ISIS or Haqqan? Yeah, I think it was Taliban and ISIS. And then they had a second set of 600 they knew were ISIS. So they actually put out the number that they knew there's 2,000 just in the country. And that did not include Al Qaeda's numbers, which is really interesting. So it's a lot larger. And they didn't
Mhm.
include other groups. So there's other groups who sent attackers here, right? Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan is a really great one. Obviously, Hezbollah attackers are here. Tariqi Taliban Pakistan sent terrorists here. Like there's a large number. There's a lot of different Pakistani. Lashkar-e-Taiba sent people here. Jaish-e-Mohammed. So when you lay out all the groups, the number gets very high, but they're only kind of talking about a couple of groups, which I find interesting as well. And it's I think
Mm.
a lack of collection.
Yeah. And so I was basically bold enough to say that your information, I think on one of the interviews I said, so take what Sarah Adams just said and multiply that by 10. And the reason why I said that was not to say that I'm smarter than you, because clearly I'm not, but the reason was to say if this is what we know,
Mm-hmm.
then lessons learned from October 7th, that's what happened is we were preparing. I know the IDF was preparing. I know the intelligence community, of course, they do their preps and whatnot and make sure we get the information we need so that we know how to prepare and so on, defenses, what have you. And based on what we knew, right? Because we knew there was going to be a multi-front war. This I've known for years, actually, not just on October 7th, and all of a sudden you're attacked from Lebanon and Syria and all these 7 different fronts. But with that said, what I'm saying is my lessons learned from October 7th is if you think that the threat is X, then multiply it. Why? Because mentally you'll be better prepared when everything goes south, when it is, you know what I mean? Because I think that's the biggest problem that a lot of people have, both here and in the West, is they're too comfortable with what they know and they don't prepare for what we don't know, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah. That's extremely important. And actually, terrorists have goals, right? And we need to
Hmm.
be honest what their plans and goals are. And at least according to Al Qaeda, they view the Hamas attacks as a dress rehearsal. They want the death count in the United States to be 10 times that of the Hamas attacks, and they want the next 9/11 attack to be 3 times the size of the original 9/11. So these are things we're not prepared for. A few years after 9/11, we got really prepared, really vigorous on things, and then everything has fallen off to where you can't even talk about Al Qaeda anymore. So yeah, it is time to be honest because if they do meet their goals, this is going to be very devastating. It will be the largest terrorist attack ever on U.S. soil.
Yeah. And probably globally, I would imagine if they're going to
Hmm.
try, because I think you were also saying that they want to make a message, so to speak, get a message across. And I think the best message they can get across is take the number one world superpower and bring them to their knees, so to speak, by a devastating terrorist attack. Um, what are some of the threats that people should be aware of, they should be looking for, and I guess we'll also answer, I guess, some preparatory work that they can do, right, to counter those threats.
Yeah, well, we believe there's going to be a lot more kind of smaller scale attacks like New Orleans was. I think people kind of ignore New Orleans because the death count was around 14, but his bombs didn't go off. And I think they were supposed to probably go off at midnight. It got delayed. Then, he was like, what do I do? And he kind of went into the ramming and it's shot and done because he didn't want the attack to completely fail, right? But
Hmm.
if it had gone off as planned, I mean, there could have been up to 100 plus deaths in that. And I think we need to be honest about that. And are all communities prepared for that? They aren't, right? So just something that's simple. Now, another thing is some of these attacks will have teams, right? So we have seen the terrorists train in 5 to 7 and then 8 to 10 man teams. Well, in the US, when they prepare for one active shooter in the community. All the active shooter scenarios are for one shooter, right? So we're
Mhm.
not prepared for that.
We're
Another
talking
thing
about
that we
law
like to
enforcement
tell,
when you talk about preparedness. So that's usually
yeah,
what
or
law
just
enforcement is ready
companies,
for. Or okay, okay,
yeah,
or companies, okay.
schools, like I worked in aviation. We did an active shooter drill, and it was one active shooter that came into our business when we did the drill. Just in general,
Mhm,
airport when they train, it's one active shooter or one bomb going off, for example, when
mhm,
they want to do phases in this attack, right? So there could be suicide bombings, and then shooters come in or vehicle rams, etc. And then the last part is we've really just been forthcoming with people about what we've seen them train on, right? Because then you at least can focus on something in your community. So we have seen them train on hospitals, shopping complexes, churches, nightclubs, kind of almost like what happened with Pulse, right? So if you know, hey, these are the things at least the terrorists are training on for what's coming here, at least you can start hardening those and making them have to shift their tactics and their targets, which we want them to do, because then you get more time to thwart them.
mhm. I think you brought this up. I actually didn't hear about this before. Was the attack in Miami at a nightclub, and you're mentioning, I think you were mentioning how the main target was actually Disneyland or something like that.
Yeah. So
I
what
think that was a
happened? It was
really good example as a case study
mm-hmm.
of here's a success story, right? In a way, even though unfortunately attack did get carried out.
Well, they've now it's more off Mumbai, but that one is very similar. So what they have done is they said, "Hey, we need to give these terrorists the freedom to do their own targeting in real time so they can make these decisions," right? So that terrorist, he was in Orlando. His name was Omar Mateen. His target was downtown Disney area. Him and his wife surveilled it. The day he went to go attack it, there was too much security, right? So he's like, I'm not going to attack this target. He rolled to a second, and then the third was Pulse that night, and he chose Pulse, right? So for the homeland attacks, they said, yes, terrorists, we want you to make that decision because we want you to go choose the attack where you'll be able to carry it out the longest, have the most deaths, hold ground longer. You make that decision. We're not going to tell you that. So, really, the only um, stable piece of the homeland plot is there's an aviation piece. And obviously, that's more detailed. You're going to get on this flight and do this type of thing. But all the ground attacks across US communities, the terrorists will choose, and that's a very complicated thing. And we have to prepare for multiple scenarios because if you think they're attacking one place, they can divert or they can just do something diversionary, like you were kind of talking about when we talked about Norway, and then they go do the attack elsewhere.
Yeah. So yeah, so talking about Norway, and this is something that because we have the Gathering Storm book that's going to be released and so on, that's going to have a lot of good tidbits. But one of the things that I noticed was missing, if you like, as far as a case study, and it's something that's really fascinating me because I was at a conference for a bunch of Christians talking about Israel and so on, and I'll never forget that weekend. I was at that conference, and my Norwegian friends who are also part of this conference, our Christian friends from Norway, they were devastated because of this attack that happened literally during that. I think it was that weekend or something like that, and it was just a very sobering moment to be in a country during a terrorist attack where I'm normally in Israel, where we're used to it, and to see their reaction, to see how it hit them and impacted them. And then I remember just really looking into that. That's why it drew my attention. I really looked into the attacker, and the guy was a Looney Tune. He said he took Krav Maga from like Israeli instructors, and he learned, whatever weapons elsewhere. It's like this dude was just collecting intel from everywhere and anywhere, and he was psychologically just a total Looney Tune, right? I mean, he was not your classic terrorist, but the reason why this I think is important as a case study is because he was also a very smart terrorist. It was one dude, and he brought the whole nation to their knees, right? By planting bombs that would go off in central Oslo while he gets on a ferry to his
Mm-hmm.
target, which is a group of political youth group from one of the political parties. that he completely disagreed with and whatever. And in his response was, "I'm going to carry this horrible attack." And the thing is that I think is I'm curious is, are terrorists not looking at that attack and maybe trying to replicate, for example, him dressing like a police officer? And I remember from listening to eyewitness accounts of the people that were these kids that said, he said, come to us," and he was wearing a police uniform, right? And essentially they're running to their death without even knowing it. Is that something you think the terrorists would try to replicate, something similar to that in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think the piece that there's multiple phases is really important, right? Because like
Mm,
you said, he basically hit around like the parliament and the government area of Oslo. As you can imagine, then all the attention focuses there. We do believe there's going to be diversionary things like that. A little more to create noise and to sideline first responders. You get them to all go there to either attack them again or to then go do your other attack. The other thing is we do believe they're going to use uniforms. We not just October 7th, but they've actually been successfully doing it now in Somalia. I don't know if you saw the video. Basically, a senior commander, in there, and then the Somali National Army was giving it one of those pet speeches to his troops. And one of the terrorists was in the uniform and walked up and shot him in the
right.
head during
Correct.
that speech.
Yeah.
They also have some insiders involved in some of the plotting they're doing where the embassies are located, for example. So this has happened for a long time. I mean, when I was serving in Pakistan, there was a day, gentlemen dressed as the actual guards for the UN walked into the building and blew up. The funny part is I came home that night and I had a new guard. I called the boss of the company and said, "This is insane. You need to bring my guy back. I can't see a new guard here today. Like, I'm
Right.
gonna lose it on this guy." Like, but you know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
don't always pay attention to the faces, right? It's like, oh, there's a
Hmm.
uniform, it's safe. And, come in, you're focused on so many other things, and it's very dangerous. And they know that we're weak in that regard, and people will just make assumptions. Yeah, that person should be here. I actually was up doing a briefing up on the hill a few months ago, and Boone was up there with me, and I said, just park illegally alongside of the building. So you know your client. He said, "I'm not gonna be able to do that." I said, "Yes, you will. No one pays attention in DC." And he sat out almost from by my window for 90 minutes. If he had a car bomb, he would have killed hundreds of members of Congress and their staff. Not one person walked up and said a thing to him. And this is in the heart of DC. This is the heart of the Hill. And so we become so complacent.
Yeah. Wow. Well, fortunately in Israel, we're a little bit more on point with that. I remember years ago working security, where I started my security work for the government, and I was in downtown Jerusalem, and I remember the guys briefing me on previous history of terror attacks and that kind of thing, because that's kind of what we do. Is we when you're walking into a new area or whatever, you kind of get a history of the lay of the land. And I'll never forget, they pointed out, because where the government buildings were adjacent to Mash Sharim, which is the ultra Orthodox community, there were terrorists that dressed like ultra Orthodox. And I don't know if they got on the bus or they were on their way to get onto a bus and then clacked themselves off. But the ones who weeded them out were the local ultra Orthodox community, because they got the dress code mixed up. Because
Mm-hmm.
what I think a lot of people don't know, especially tourists, they come and they see a bunch of black coats, as they call them, and they say, "Oh, look, there's a ultra Orthodox," and it's like, well, you do realize there's like hundreds of different cliques, and it's usually the dress code and how they is how they differentiate each other. Um, so I think, like, how do Americans get prepared for something like that? You know what I mean? It's like you're not a tight knit community, right? People are very, very independent, very individualistic, right? It's me and my family. A lot of times you don't even know who your neighbor is. You know what I mean? And that's my observation from traveling to the States. And those are the weak points that I see. What would you say to the local American community who would have a threat like this, and you literally could be the one that could expose it before it happens because you were aware, because you noticed, right? The EMT uniform was
Mm-hmm.
off, or the police uniform was off. He's wearing a DC uniform versus Washington State uniform. I don't know. Um, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's funny. The other day, I went by a fire truck and I was like, why is that fire truck here? It's nowhere near us. And it's not even our county because obviously local counties come and respond. It was weird and I noticed it right away. But I don't know if a lot of people pay attention, look at the name. But we had that incident recently where someone bought this used fire truck offline and they were using it to rob homes for the fires in California. Well, not a
Wow.
terrorist. Terrorists can obviously take advantage of the same thing. What we really try to do is we first just tell people you can't help anyone until you have yourself squared away in your family. So we say, obviously, to family emergency preparedness.
Hmm.
I live in Florida. It's a lot easier because Floridians have a lot of emergency plans. So it's just kind of like, here's what you add on, for a terrorist incident. Because, we lose power for a week and all these type of things, lose communications. The stores go empty, everything that's probably going to happen if something like this goes down. And then we do say, like you said, there is a disconnect. Things were a lot more on the community level and it's breaking up, mostly from politicians. So we're focused more on the groups that are cohesive, right? So in America, there's a lot of community groups like Lions Club, Kiwanis. So we spend time on those. We've always spent time on church communities, so talking to churches, Jewish community centers, etc. So we focused on groups that already have naturally formed and said, hey, you take the lead, you support your community, you take care of each other. And we think that's one of the best ways to do it. And they have been the most proactive then of reaching out to like their sheriff's department, their fire stations. I mean, I have people showing up all the time at fire stations. They must be like, oh, Sarah Adams sent another crazy person to my fire station. I didn't. Just people are randomly doing it. Like, are you prepared for this? Um, so that's, I think, the best way to do it is focus on the community organization and let them roll with it. Because obviously it's going to take time to get all Americans prepared. Most of them don't even know about this threat. So you have to take some of these leaders who already know how to self-organize.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I'll just give an example for my community, right where I live. We have a group WhatsApp, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in that group WhatsApp, all of a sudden you're able to surface, like you said, you notice that fire truck that was out of the ordinary, and you had no one to talk about it except yourself, right? With that
Mm-hmm.
observation, in our community, if there's a vehicle that doesn't belong, that nobody recognizes from the neighbors because we're a smaller community, then it will find itself in the WhatsApp. Does anybody know whose truck this is? Does this belong to anyone? Right. And if we don't get an answer, there's going to be local law enforcement that's going to come and look into it, license plate, the whole thing. Right. Um, so, one piece of advice I would say that I can throw out there from what we do is for your neighborhood, is my recommendation, is get a group neighborhood text messaging, a group text messaging forum, and it has to be, of course, managed to where I have a problem with a cat in my tree or some stupid stuff like that, right? Like to where you also censor it, you know. And I think that's very helpful. That's very helpful because once, I'm saying, once you're spreading out that net, then you're not alone anymore. And it's not just about you and your own powers of observation and ability to protect and to prepare, like you were saying, like a lot of Floridians are. And I got a lot of good friends in Florida, so I know the mindset, and I love the mindset of Floridians, especially the ones that have live in the tornado alley. They are really squared away with, like you said, with contingencies and plans, and they're used to that. And I think you're closer to that kind of mindset than as Israelis, right? Who are used to knowing where's the closest bomb shelter, what contingencies if this and that happens, right? Um, and so then you also talked about churches, right? And or synagogues. And I would also throw out there and say you should get to know your local mosque, um,
Uh-huh.
and the leadership there, because in my opinion, and this I know is also something that very few talk about from our side of the political spectrum, if you like, or what have you. It's like, well, why do you care about the Muslim community? Well, because they're going to be targeted, in my opinion, because once terrorists are going to go carry out the plans that they're planning to do, who do you think is going to be targeted as retribution for those attacks? So how nice would it be to know, for them to know, that local Muslim community to know they can rely on you as a faith group, right? That is going to protect them.
Yeah, well, another thing that's really important because people look at it in that way, but it actually there's a way more useful purpose. So at least for the U.S. homeland attackers, they're they're basically here as clean operatives, like I like to say. But sometimes a clean operative is just like you're Syrian and you have a Jordanian passport, right? Well, only in your community does a person know when they're talking to you, "Hey, this guy's Syrian, but he came here and pretended to be Jordanian. Like, this does not make sense." They're the ones that are going to notice those nuances and report them. But if you're
Mhm.
not engaging with them and you're not explaining the threat to them, they might be a little unoblivious to looking at that, but they will be the first ones. I mean, I've even said we need to push. We've got a lot of these kind of interpreters from Iraq, Afghanistan. Why are they not working our southern border? Why are we not using them as consultants? They can talk to these people with these Afghan passports, be like, "That's not an Afghan, that's not an Afghan. This says he's a Norzai. He's not from that family. He doesn't even have the accent of that family." But we're not using the skills we have in our own country, and I think it's very dangerous to not tap into them.
Oh, 100%. I thought that is a great point. Um, and you know what? That's exactly what Israel does. That's how we're able to get our human intelligence, because we have what we call speakers, I guess, roughly translated. Basically, they speak the local language, dialect. They can pick up, like you said, if the person is claiming to be from Ramallah, and they talk long enough. It's like, no, 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 he doesn't have a Ramallah accent. He has a Hebron accent. And then you can, so for interrogation purposes, you're able to hone in on, what group he's a part of. Oh, you're part of the radical Hamas group here in Hebron, and here you are trying to play it up like you're just a softball PLO dude from Ramallah, for example,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
Um, yeah, so that is I think a really good point. I mean, you can utilize a lot of languages. I mean, there's a lot of different threats coming through the U.S., right? From the borders, and also from unfortunately, I think you're pointing that out. They're literally flying in. I mean, what
Yeah.
should be the hardest way to get into the U.S.
Yeah. And when you talk about the dialects too, it's really interesting. I don't know if you saw, it was a couple months ago, there was an assassination attempt on an Afghan. He was basically staying in a hotel. The British government was making all the refugees stay in as they processed them. Obviously, the hotel then had a lot of terrorists in it. And so he got targeted by some of the terrorists in the hotel because they knew who he was. He was like a social media figure. So they bust into his room and tried to stab him to death. Well, of course, their faces are covered during the incident, but as they communicate with each other, he knows exactly where they're from,
Mm-hmm.
right? In Afghanistan, and obviously he's from an area, right? They're from an area that's very strong Haqqani network.
Mm-hmm.
So he, even while trying to protect and save himself, could hear that, right? Like that's so important.
Yeah. Um, man. So again, like people are like I said, I'm getting a lot of requests. I believe you're getting a lot of requests. I know Scott Mann's getting a lot of requests. And people are very concerned because of basically what you're saying, what others have been saying, right? They've been trying to warn. Um, and what what other advice would you say people should have to to help them prepare for what's coming? What other angles
I
should they be focusing on?
So I've noticed this trend in the United States that even if you're talking about like the best sheriff there is, it's
Mhm.
almost like they're waiting for some directive to come down, right, from the federal government or the governor. And really, what I want to say is just prepare. I was at a range a few weeks ago, and I ran into this gentleman. He was like, "There, I'm on a very small SWAT team. I forget it was like 8 or 9. We saw your video. We're now preparing 3 to 4 times a week after our work hours, doing more right, as
Mhm.
a team, like, they took the self-initiative. I think we're gonna need more of that because if everyone sits around and waits for the threat to be passed down, it's gonna be too late to prepare, right?
Yeah.
You have to just do it yourself, and it's sometimes hard for people to self-initiate. You become yes man a lot, right? "Oh,
Right.
we gotta wait for the boss to do it." I mean, there are lives on the line right now. We need everyone to prepare, even if it's just preparing your family and having to talk with your kids, like, hey, I'm a flight ground stop. I'm in Iowa for 5 days. Do you have access to cash? What do you do if you can't communicate? Who in the neighborhood are you going to go to? Right? Like, there'll be your extended family. Just simple things like that should be done, and it will help you in any emergency.
Yeah. I think a good piece of advice too is to locate the former military people that you either know or need to know in your community, in your neighborhood, right? Now I know a lot of those guys are going to be pissed if they're going to start getting knocks on their door now because warning, not all of these guys are too happy to have their privacy invaded, because a lot of these guys are what do you call them? Not introverts, but they recluses, right?
Mhm.
It's like you live through, I don't know, 10 years, 20 years of military hell, and you literally just want to go fish on the pond right now and just be
Mhm.
left to yourself, right? So in a way, it's kind of a two-way road. Is those people who have been through hell and back, they need to, in a way, give up their me time, my downtime, my disconnect, or whatever it is that they're getting away from, so to speak. And they need to be able to make themselves available because they have skill sets, right? I
Mhm.
can't imagine what it would be like to be a civilian that did not know how to shoot a weapon, hand-to-hand combat, medical, right? Oh, just put a band-aid. No, 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 no. Like, because people say, oh, I'm prepared. I have a first aid kit. I'm like, do you know what a first aid kit does? Like what it's for? I mean, you need to have trauma care. You need to have trauma training. It's not just something that you just, Google
Mhm.
online, although that's better than nothing, right? If you look at some YouTube clips or whatever from people who are, God only knows what they're going to get, but you got to do something, right?
Yeah. And one thing we like to bring up is, there was, of course, the shooting in Las Vegas that killed 600.
Hmm.
Well, they say the majority of people who actually survived their wounds were because so many current and former military officers were at this concert that knew how to do the trauma, and they jumped in and did those initial tourniquets or pack those wounds, and they're the ones that saved lives. They got lucky to have that kind of, even though so many died, they got lucky to they were in that community already. And we can just use those people. So when I was overseas, it's not like there's teams that come and train you on first aid. But what you do is you go to who's ever the medic, or if the Marines are on the base, you go to their medic and say, "Hey, let's host a session." And it's almost impossible to get, no one is going to say no if you say, will you come and host a session and teach people how to do this? And I think that is the most important thing. I always tell people, medical, at least you can save someone's life if you know the basics. And as you know, there's going to be a very large time delay in first responders to these incidents, partially because the terrorists want to delay, right?
Hmm.
And they want to keep them at bay. So people really need to think about, how am I going to save my family, and then how might I save someone else's life in this situation?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a really good point what you just brought up there, the issue of no one's coming to save you, right?
Mhm.
You have to have that as your baseline. Your baseline, in my opinion, is no one's coming to save you. You are all there is, right? You are your VIP security. You are your own medic. You are your own provider, if you like. Now, again, not everybody has that makeup and mindset. I got it. But there has to be at least one person like that in your family, in your community, in your close knit,
Mhm.
right? And like you were saying, right? You probably didn't get all of that medical training or all of this, whatever. You had your training, but you took initiative because you're like, you know what? Maybe I should learn this, right? And I think that's a great point. You go to someone who knows it. You go to your friend who works in the NTs, someone who is a combat medic or whatever, and just say, hey, could you please show us some basics? And again, my recommendation is, in order not to bug these people, because again, a lot of these people, they just want to be left alone. But if you want to get the most bang for your buck, have your church, your synagogue, local civic center, whatever gathering, community gathering, and that everybody at one time can get that training from that individual who knows how to teach you how to shoot, to do self-defense, and or medic, right, or medical assistance, because you need to be prepared for example in Gaza, the Gaza communities, sorry, the Jewish communities around Gaza, we ran to go get to those people that were being under attack. But guess what? The highways, right, the main junction points, they were heavily ambushed. The terrorists
Mm-hmm.
knew that we would be coming, and then they knew, oh, RPG, that savannah full of operators, and in one blow, I mean, you lost the whole team, right? And that happened repeatedly, and so that's what slowed down a lot of the complaints that I've seen here is they say, where was the military? It was, it never came. That's not true. I've spoken to enough people and enough guys who have been in all different communities where they fought the terrorists. It was just such a wave of an attack. It took a while to get to the you who is at the end of the line, so to speak, from this backup and this mess that was created. So if you can't tourniquet yourself, right, because you were able to get away from the attack, from the threat, but now you're bleeding to death. If you can't tourniquet yourself, you're going to die and it's over. And you need to be prepared for that. You need to be prepared to spend a day, a two, or three. I would, I don't know, you might know better. How long would you say things could get backed up on such a large scale attack to where you're going to see any EMTs, any military, law enforcement, anything? Like the worst case scenario.
Yeah, so the community attacks I think won't be as long. I think when they pull off, if they do their next 9/11, I think it could be multiple days because they want to attack, our government institutions, our airlines. So the things that would bring you aid, it's going to be crippled, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we like to bring up, kind of on your issue, is right if you're a church or whomever and you're hosting these community trainings, also maybe be a location where you stockpile supplies like tourniquets, water, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the terrorists do attack, let's say you're in a mid-tier city and they attack the only trauma unit, and no one can get to the hospital, well, now you are a force multiplier for your community, right? And it's useful anyway for when you do the training. So it's trying to get people to think like that. In the U.S., we thwarted so many terrorist attacks that people like, yeah, yeah, for years you told me to be their attack, and there wasn't. It's like, yes, because they were thwarted. This one's
Right.
not thwarted, and it's so hard to get over that bump, right? And
Yeah.
it's just like, please prepare. It's gonna help your family no matter what. Even just having the discussion when something bad happens, your family was aware. Like I was on my college campus when 9/11 happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I didn't even know the basics of terrorism. I didn't know who Osama bin Laden was, right? Like there were so many questions
Yeah.
where you can prevent all that confusion by just having discussions now. I actually brought my friend's daughter years ago to the Spy Museum in DC. And at the time, they've now changed it to like a cyber room. But at the time, there was a room and it was the video of the planes hitting 9/11. And she said, "What is that?" I said, "What do you mean, what is that?" She had never heard of 9/11.
Wow.
Right? We have a generation of people that have not heard of 9/11. Like, as a parent, sit down and discuss that. That's your job to talk about this with them.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that that's also a really good point is what parents can do, right? It's not just about communities, it's not just about the big picture, but it's also what you as a parent um, should be focusing on showing and teaching your kids. And I think it's a travesty that if there's any children in America, right, which I'm learning as well, that there's a whole generation haven't even heard of the Holocaust, right?
Mhm.
And so when Jews have been attacked on October 7th, and we say this is the worst attack since the Holocaust on the Jewish people, they have no context. What even Holocaust? What is that, right?
Mhm.
So it's important. This is a good message, I think, for parents, right? It's important that you recognize the educational system is not necessarily going to prepare your child for basic history, important history, current, like as in a few years ago history, right? They might know who Benjamin Franklin is, maybe,
Mhm.
maybe, but it's also important that you prepare them for the knowledge and you pass on that knowledge that you've acquired as an adult who have lived through that, right? Like I've done with my kids. I tell my kids what I've gone through, and so that way they recognize they're not the only ones having to run to a bomb shelter. Dad grew up under this threat in northern Israel. This was my reality, right? Um, and so it's like sharing that information versus holding it to yourself and just assuming, oh yeah, of course, because you know what I mean, because you assume everyone knows what you know, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's an easy Achilles heel to have and not notice.
Well, it's funny. So the first time I went on the Sean Ryan show, it was like forever until he released it. And then the day before he released it, he's like, "Hey, I'm releasing it tomorrow. I don't think this is going to go over my audience's head. I'm not really sure they're interested in it." And then, like a half hour after he was released, he's like, "Oh my God, I have to get you back." I did not realize so many people weren't aware of this, right? Because
Right.
we assume, especially Sean was in the agency with me, we assume things still are the way they were when we were there. We assume these things are being done. It was in 2015 when I went over to the CIA and realized they weren't hunting the Benghazi attackers, because I assumed it. I would have done it. That's when we went after them ourselves. But in my head, I thought they were like kicking down doors and detaining these guys, and that was, oh my God, they're doing nothing, right? So we
Yeah.
have to not assume it's being done and learn it for ourselves. We're at that point, unfortunately, like our government is failing in some areas, and one actually is counterterrorism. We need to be honest about it and educate ourselves.
100%. Well, Sarah, I don't want to take up too much of your time. What I'd like to do is, what do you have that I can direct people towards? I know you've been involved with some books that have been released, um, um, websites. How can people find you, get more information, etc.?
Yeah, so as you brought up earlier, Task Force Pineapple put together
Mm-hmm.
the Gathering Storm. It's tfpineapple.org. You can get it there as a hard copy. They're a small little nonprofit, so it's a little slower to get mailed to you, but you can buy the ebook too if you want it right away.
Mm-hmm.
We have a website. It's Askari Media Group, Askari mediagroup.com. There you can get links to our investigations. I haven't put our ISIS one up yet, but you can get obviously the link to our book, Benghazi Know the Enemy, but every investigation we've done since we've released free to the public. So our Abbey Gate investigation is free. Our October 7th plotting investigation is free. And then, like I said, just on April 13th, we put out a investigation to Islamic State Khorasan prods. So all those can be downloaded for free. And then my main social media is TPA Sarah on X. And then our investigation is Askari Media Group on Instagram. And we share a little more on Instagram for preparedness, because the terrorists are on um, X, but they don't like the terrorists on Instagram because of the photos and kind of the community of Instagram. So actually, there's less terrorists monitoring me on Instagram. So we are a little more forward leaning there to help people prepare better and to share some of the tactics we're hearing and learning. As you know,
Yeah.
some things we can just go tell law enforcement. Some things are almost uncomprehendable to the public of what's going to happen. And we don't want to also put people in fear where they do nothing to prepare. So it's kind of like this delicate balance of, just prepare yourself and let's hope the government steps up and defends us and thwarts this, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and talk about the government. What can people do as far as petitioning? Where would you? How would you recommend them to who to petition to take action so that they can be better protected, right? Because they're not spooks, they're not spec ops guys, they're not SWAT guys, they're not a beat cop, they're not EMT, right? But those bodies can be empowered, and I have friends in all of those areas, and the constant complaint is budget.
Mm-hmm.
They don't get taken seriously for someone like me or you to come in and have us come and do sessions with or whatever, right? So it's, and like you said, it's politics. It's
Mm-hmm.
but what about we the people, right? You know,
Yeah.
we the
What
people have much more power than they think, right?
It's really interesting with the politics. So I was up in New York City recently, and I was hoping to meet the NYPD Intel division, and their senior leadership said I was too controversial. So they wouldn't even get a threat briefing from me because of politics, right? I mean, that's a
Mhm.
very dangerous and concerning situation in New York City. Um, where all the heroes live. Scary.
Yeah.
That they don't probably know the details of the upcoming Homeland plot, right? Because of some senior leaders in the organization not wanting to play. So that's a problem. But yeah, a lot of people are like, oh, well, who do we write in Congress? We spent a lot of time to fund the Taliban. It's sitting in the Senate. They're not doing their job. So, like you said, I've been focused on how you get the resources in your community to make sure your law enforcement has the training, make sure they have the equipment they need. And that's sometimes your governor has the power to do that. Florida, we do have larger budgets to help law enforcement. Other places, there's been a squeeze on law enforcement, right? So, is there something you can do at a community level? Can you do a fundraiser? There's communities who fundraise just for military equipment, right? I mean,
Yeah.
for police equipment. Um, so there's all these small things you can do that can be supportive. Um, and you really have to go down and talk to your local police. The sheriff is who has a lot of the power, right? And then even people would be surprised. We have had a lot of discussions with mayors, city attorneys who say, "What do I need to do? I don't even know the gaps in this. I don't understand it. Like, how do I enable them?" And so also look at those local political leaders. People don't actually think of them having power, but they can be real force multipliers to get these resources to our law enforcement because they're the ones who need to be trained. They're the first responders, and they're the ones that threat too because the terrorists are going to target them.
Hmm. Awesome. So that is a call to action for you all out there. Know that you have power to petition your local mayors, sheriffs, etc. And I think even if the politics are whatever they are currently, the fact that they're getting swamped with people like you who are telling them, "Hey, this is what I voted for. Here's what I want. This is
Mhm.
what we're requiring." Eventually, they're going to have to bend, right? Because when there's enough of a flood of requests coming in, I don't see them being able to just kind of brush that under the rug, so to speak, right? And then you're empowering the people that are at the bottom of that chain, right? Who are the ones who are going to end up responding to the threats and better prepared for those threats and getting the training they need, the gear that they need, like you pointed out. And I think that's very important. As far as the resources that you mentioned, we're going to have that in the description here at the bottom of this episode. So make sure to go down there and follow Sarah, get connected with all of what she just pointed out there, what she just said there. For people who are not aware, the things that she just offered to that you can download, that you can read, that you can see, and stuff that I've been enjoying, and fellow teammates in my team have been enjoying in receiving this information from Sarah. And so we definitely salute you, and my teammates are extending their gratitude and thankfulness for your boldness to speak out and to let us know what's happening. And like you said, and when people like us are aware of these threats, then we also, the ones who take initiative, are going to take initiative, and we're going to implement
Mhm.
into our training. And that is a huge game changer for the terrorists and their plots. So make sure to go get those resources, guys. This is very important, very, very, very important. I can't overstress how important this information is, and the fact that you're able to be able to get that, and how that's going to help you down the line. Sarah, thank you so much for this interview. Really appreciate you taking your time to be on the show.
Thanks for having me.